What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting, extremely cold episode right here on the MIgardener channel. We're freezing our buns off for you, so I hope you guys are going to really enjoy this one and take something from it to help you grow big or go home and help spread the gardening knowledge across the gardening community. So what are we talking about today? Well, in today's episode, we're going to be talking all about composting misconceptions and mistruths. This is something that I think is not talked enough about, but there's on the flip side, the misconceptions are talked a lot about. And so I want to kind of break down the misconceptions and kind of just clarify, because I see so many of them coming into our inbox where I just feel like rather than answer them one by one, I'm just going to answer them all at once in this video. And therefore it gives you a reference you can come back to at any time. Or if you hear this myth come up, you can say, hey, Luke did a video on it. Check it out. So so we're going to talk about those now. I got my compost pile behind me here, and we're just going to talk about some of the most common composting misconceptions. If it takes 2 or 3 of these videos, we'll make it into a little mini series, but I want to start with the big ones first, and then I'll let you guys sound off in the comments box below with any other questions you might have or any other kind of misconceptions you've heard of before, and if we have enough of them, we'll do a second one. So, all right, let's get going. All right, so the first biggest misconception I want to talk about is with the compost pile itself. There are so many people that say you can have a hot compost pile by simply just piling up anything and it will get hot. This could not be further from the truth. In order to hot compost, you have to have the right ratio of carbon to nitrogen. We've talked about this so much. You cannot just throw anything in a compost pile and expect it to get hot. In fact, this compost pile is a prime example of one that is not going to get hot enough until I add enough carbon to this pile, because there's far too much nitrogen. As you can see, there is pumpkins from Halloween, there's kitchen scraps, there's a bunch of green material, and there's not a whole lot of leaves and brown material. The ratio is far too imbalanced with nitrogen, and therefore it's not going to heat up. If I were to add a bunch of leaves and then I were to have a couple warm days where I could get the microbial life going like crazy, we could get this thing to heat up no problem at all. But as is, this will not heat up. And so no, you can't just throw anything into a compost pile and expect it to get hot. And secondly to that, you can't just make any size pile and expect it to heat up as well. A compost pile needs to be at least 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, so 9 cubic feet. So 3 feet wide by 3 feet long by 3 feet tall. That is going to give you 9 cubic feet, and that's exactly why our compost corral is those dimensions. We made those dimensions specifically so that when we make a pile, it fills up this compost corral. We know we have enough biomass to generate a hot compost pile. Now, the next misconception is that if you don't have carbon, it won't compost. That's something I really want to touch on, because that is a huge misconception, in that people think, well, if I don't add leaves or I don't add newspaper, people have told them that their compost literally will not break down. And that could not be further from the truth. You know, what happens when you leave a pumpkin outside, or if you leave an apple core, or anything organic for that matter? What happens when you leave it outside? Well, it starts to rot, then it molds, and then that mold breaks it down, it starts to degrade, and degrading is decomposing. It's turning back into the essential elements that it was formed from. It's breaking down into its simplest form, which is, compost. And so what you want to do is, if you have not enough carbon and you just have a bunch of nitrogen stuff, a bunch of kitchen scraps, still throw it in a pile. Throw it in a pile, and then what you want to do is give it a little more time. This type of pile will take a lot longer to break down, yes, but it still will break down, because what's going to happen is there won't be as much microbial life breaking this down. It won't break down as fast, but you will get a lot of worms that will come in. You'll get a ton of worm activity that will come in here and start to break this down. You will get some molds and some rot and some mildew. And that might sound bad and negative, but it actually is not really that bad. This will not smell that bad as long as we don't add a whole lot of things that are rich in sulfurs, like eggshells are very rich in kind of sulfide compounds. Meats and stuff are something you never really want to throw on a compost pile, because if you add a lot of those sulfur compounds, you will get a really, really foul smell. But when it comes to just breaking down things like pumpkins and beans and beets and carrot tops and pretty much everything left over from Thanksgiving. All those kitchen scraps, if you throw those in there, they're not gonna break down super fast, but they will break down and they really won't smell that bad because they're not really rich in those sulfide compounds. It'll smell like something's degrading. It'll smell like it's breaking down, but it won't be foul. So, you know, just throw it in the pile and it still will break down even if you don't have the carbon. But if you want it to break down faster, add the carbon. All right, we're going on a field trip over to one of our raised beds for the third composting misconception. All right. Wow, it is really, really cold out. You know, being from Michigan and growing up in Michigan, we're kind of used to the cold, but I'll tell you what, it's days like this that are, they're damp. They're damp days. It's the damp days that are the coldest. It just feels like 10 or 20 degrees colder than it actually is. You know, it's only 35 degrees out, which I say only. For most people, that is like you're staying inside and you're bundled up with blankets. But I mean, if the sun was out today, there'd be people walking around and you wouldn't even really realize that it was a 35, 36 degree day. But it's that humidity, it's that damp mugginess that comes in the air that it feels like it just pulls every bit of heat out of your body. Oh man, it's a cold one. So the third compost misconception that we're going to talk about is, can you have too much compost? And this is really where it gets into an opinion, because you know, science will tell you you might be able to have too much compost. And these are where I kind of say, you know, when it comes to a scientific study, you do have to kind of take it sometimes with a grain of salt, because in a scientific study, it's not always real world. You know, a lot of times in scientific studies, they push the boundaries. They say, you know, can you ever have too much compost? And they'll go to the beyond extreme to prove a point. And when in reality, you know, when things are kind of kept in check naturally in a garden, in a natural setting, you cannot have too much compost, in my opinion. Now, this is where I think it's just a big misconception, because a lot of people will take these studies where there's been quite a few studies done that show that plants can have excess nitrogen. They can actually affect plant growth negatively and affect production because there's too much nitrogen and there's not enough phosphorus and potassium and other things in the compost to really give a balanced growing medium for plants to grow in. And this is, yes, this is absolutely true. You know, if you give plants too much nitrogen, they will favor the nitrogen and they will continue growing. But I really want to get at the source of the compost. You see, not all compost is created equal. And if you go with a very natural, well-balanced compost, there is really no way to have too much of it. Now, if you compost things like animal manures, which is what the studies were showing, the studies were using animal manures that were composted down. They had about 8% nitrogen and only about 1 or 2% phosphorus and potassium. The balance is really there's really no balance at all. And so it's very out of balance when it comes to nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Whereas our compost, we grow in pure compost. Our compost, we made on the premise, and we've actually brought in compost from a composting facility that utilizes yard scraps and animal manures and paper shreddings and anything that'll break down pretty much. They'll break those down in a very homogenized mixture. It's not just all one thing. And what we find is through doing several NPK tests on our soil, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is right around 2% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, and about 2% potassium. So 212 is the NPK of just the compost that we're growing in. Now that is far different than just a pure broken down animal manure, which I agree, you can add too much of that to your soil. If you add too much chicken manure to your soil, you'll have a wonderful, wonderful green plants, your lettuces, your spinaches, those things will do wonderful because that's pretty much all they utilize is nitrogen. But if you throw something like a tomato or a potato or any fruiting type plant into that soil, you'll find that it produces more foliage than it does actual fruit. And so in those studies, they really kind of did the gardening community a disservice because many of those people cite those sources as 100% fact, but they didn't really look at it in a real world example of, when you eat breakfast, yes, fruit is very important, but do you just eat just strawberries or oranges or whatever your favorite fruit is? Eat just that every breakfast. And then while you're at it, eat that just for lunch and just for dinner, just that one fruit. Don't eat anything else. Really? I mean, that's kind of how I like to look at it. You know what I mean? If it's important that we have a well-balanced diet, would the same not go for your compost? And that's really how I look at it. I have never in all of my life actually thought to myself, do I have too much compost? Am I over fertilizing with my compost? I've never in a million years thought about that, because I go at it with a very common sense approach of if you're well balanced and you're looking at things logically from just a sensible perspective, it's really impossible to over fertilize your plants. But that, you'd be shocked how many people message me and say, I've heard you can over fertilize with compost. I say, baloney, absolutely baloney. That's completely false, because I would consider animal manures more of a fertilizer than a compost. All right, and the fourth and final composting misconception is that you should never, under any circumstance, compost plant material that has previously had powdery mildew or blight. And the reason why is because the theory that these blight spores and powdery mildew spores can actually be spread to future plants through the compost. And this actually could not be further from the truth, because the reason why your plants got blight in the first place was because it was actually in the soil to begin with. Blight and powdery mildew is actually a fungus. They're fungus spores that are in the soil. They're soil-borne funguses. That means that no matter where you go in the world, you're going to come in contact with blight and powdery mildew. It doesn't matter if you break it down or not, there's still going to be just as much of it as there was prior. And that's because it's found in every single continent on planet Earth. And it doesn't matter what you're composting and breaking down, because the fact of the matter is, if you take it from this bed, it's also already in that bed. If you took tomato plants and grew them in every single bed without using compost prior that had been contaminated with powdery mildew and blight, magically all of your tomatoes would be succumbed to blight eventually. And that's because it's found in every single soil. The only way it's not found in your soil is if you take your soil, all of it, throw it in the oven at 140 degrees for 15 minutes to sterilize the soil and kill all those fungus spores. It's actually going to be found in all of your soil, no matter if you're using native soil or compost. So the fact of the matter is, we see a lot of people that come in here and say, I got bad soil from a composting facility. I asked them, I told them I wanted my money back because all my tomato plants got covered in blight after I used their compost. And I said, well, did you grow tomato plants at all prior in your soil? He said, no, I know it was the compost. I said, well, before I start pointing fingers, I would really love you to just, try planting a tomato plant in just your native soil. I think you'll find it to be very shocking that the blight is still there. And they say, well, how? I thought blight was spread from plants that had previously had powdery mildew and blight. I said, no. Not quite true, and that's because the soil-borne funguses actually are native to your soil. And when stuff splashes up on your plants, that's how it happens, is splashing occurs, and that gets those little spores up, and then they colonize on the leaf structure. And then when the leaf structure is able to be colonized, they'll multiply, and then when they multiply, the air will blow them, and that's how they've learned to distribute and disperse, because they can't move throughout the soil very fast, but they can spread like a spore, dust. It spreads that dust throughout, it lands in the soil, and then that's when it colonizes again. And then that's where it multiplies and then lands on other plants, and that's how it spreads throughout the world. And so this is what I really want you guys to understand, is that no matter what, it's going to be in your garden, and no matter what you compost, it's still going to be in your garden. So don't worry about it as much as other people tell you. And even if you compost it, composting it's totally fine. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. I'm going to get inside and warm up because it is freezing cold, but I hope these nuggets of information reached you and reached you well. I hope you're staying warm and having fun wherever you're at, and hopefully you're still in the garden growing some stuff. So I'm not, but we will be soon indoors. But all right. I'll catch you all on tomorrow's episode. As always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow big or go home, stay warm, and we'll catch you all later.